everyone, it's Maddie
and me, and today we're doing our August wrap-up.
We read quite a few books this month, so let's just get right onto it.
We'll start with the books we read together. First we have Invictus by Ryan Gordon. We actually buddy read this along with Kate from Girl Reading, Lily from Sweet Love Books, and Karis from Karis on Reading, and their links will be in the description. We had so much fun reading about this group of teenagers who travel through time stealing precious artifacts. It was such a good book to have as a book club pick as well, because there was so much to talk about. We did a lot of guessing of what was going to happen next, and we were also fangirling about all of the relationships in this story because it's perfect. Also, none of us were right about literally anything we guessed. When we got into this, we couldn't put it down. It's action-packed, fast-paced, and thrilling, and one that I think everyone needs to read.
Next, we both read Moxie by Jennifer Matthew and both gave it 5 stars. I did a whole review on this book if you're interested in my thoughts, which I'll leave in the cards.
Next, we have It's Not Me, It's You by Stephanie Kate Strome, and we were convinced to buy this book by Stephanie herself when we met her at the YA Cringe Fest event, and we filmed a bit of that, so we'll leave a link to it in the cards. This is about Avery Dennis, who is the most popular girl in her year, and then she is dumped a couple of weeks before prom. So she decides to take her history assignment, which is to do an oral history, but instead of doing it about a key point in time, she decides to interview every single one of her ex-boyfriends to find out what went wrong and what she can improve on. The format is unlike anything I've read before, but I think my problem with format books is that I like it to be interspersed with regular prose. So as much as I really liked the humour in this one, I could only give it 3.5 stars because of the format. Also, there was a throwaway comment about Mary-Kate and Ashley movies, which is worth half a star in itself.
Next, we read Juniper Lemon's Happiness Index by Julie Israel, and this has been on our TBR since the Booktubeathon, but we didn't get around to it then, and we finally decided one evening that we were going to try and read it in one sitting. The book takes place around 6 months after Juniper's sister Camilla dies, and so it's all about Juniper adjusting to a life without her sister, and she has this coping mechanism where she writes down happy things and sad things that happened to her in the day and rates it out of 10. And she manages to lose a card for one of the days, but it turns out that that card also has a secret that she doesn't want anyone to know, and so she's on a hunt to find it. This didn't deal with grief as heavily as I thought it would, but I really liked the change of tone because I've read a few books like this that have similar topics, but this one felt different to all of them. Another part of the story is that Juniper finds a letter that Camilla wrote to someone and doesn't know who she's writing to, and so we thought that the story was building to the reveal of this person, but it turns out that never happens, and so we felt completely dissatisfied, and that knocked a star off our rating.
Next, I have Indigo Donut by Patrice Lawrence, and this is the story of Indigo, who is one of 7 siblings, but she doesn't know the rest of her brothers and sisters because she's in the care system. Then she meets Bailey, who is a boy at her school, and together with a connection of music, they work out more about Indigo's past, as her father killed her mother, and there's a bit of a mystery surrounding it. This was a very slow-paced contemporary, and it's quite long as well, so I wasn't engaged throughout the entire way through, but I did really like the characters, and the mystery element really kept me reading.
Next, I read No Virgin and No Shame, both by Anne Castee, and these are companion novels about Stacey Woods. The first book is about her telling the story of how she was raped and what she does about it, and then the second book is all about the court trial that comes from that. These books frustrated me. It made me angry with the system because it feels like she's just not getting justice, but you definitely get a sense of satisfaction in the second book, so if you've only read the first, then I definitely recommend the sequel. But overall, I thought these were really powerful stories, told in quite an easy to consume way. It's like a diary format, and it's not completely traumatizing throughout, like there's one scene in each that really struck a chord with me. These are both really short books as well, at around 200 pages, so if you put them together, then you've got a pretty sizable YA novel.
Next, I read The Witch's Tears by Catherine and Elizabeth Court. This is the second book in a series, and it introduces a new villain character who I think almost served the same purpose but in a slight reverse. And I really enjoy that Leo, who is Mary's older brother, had a definitely more important role in this story than in the first book, but it's not quite as witchy as I want it to be yet, but I have hopes for the third and final book, The Witch's Blood.
Next, I read Unblemished and Unraveling, the first 2 books in this trilogy by Sarah Eller. This is all about a girl called Eliana who realises that she's part of a world she didn't know when her best friend turns out to be her guardian and takes her through this lake mirror to another fairy tale world. There she realises she's a princess, her mum's a queen, she has a sibling she doesn't know about, and a new love interest that seems to hate her but is actually fallen in love with her since birth. This was a really interesting mix of all the tropes that I've seen throughout my booktube experience. It felt really familiar to me in the way that City of Bones did, in the same dynamic of characters discovering a new world, but also like Once Upon a Time the TV show because of all the fairy tale elements. In the end, I found it a little bit too generic, and there was so much world building in the first book that I got pretty lost, and the second book doesn't really do much to re-clarify those terms. If you're going to read this one, I definitely recommend paying attention and maybe keeping notes, because that'll inevitably help you.
Next, I read The Cruel Prince by Holly Black. This is the story of Jude, who gets smuggled into the fairyland after her human parents are killed, and then her half-sister's dad comes in and takes them away. In fairyland, Jude is completely obsessed with this cliquey group of fairies who are vicious and mean, but she desperately wants to be like them and even more powerful than them. Book 1 was incredibly slow, and multiple times I felt like I wanted to put it down. I am not a fan of the relationship in this book at all. I felt quite strongly that I do not want these characters to be together, and I'm scared about how the series is going to progress because of that. However, book 2, explosion of action and fun. I was suddenly invested in the characters. This is definitely gonna be a dark fairy story, so if you like Holly Black's Tithe series, you'll probably fall in love with this. I'm planning on doing a more in-depth review of this, but if you want to hear more of my thoughts, then I will leave my Goodreads review in the description.
Next, I read 36 Questions That Changed My Mind About You by Vicky Grant, and I've already unhauled this, whoops! I really didn't like this book. It's about two characters that are involved in a psychological study where they answer 36 questions in order to start a relationship and see if that's possible. It mostly focuses on just the back and forth between these characters with no other prose, so it's almost entirely in interview format, which got kind of old and predictable by the end of the book. Their banter also followed a similar pattern where they'd make fun of each other and then take the joke too seriously, and it just wasn't funny or really working. I didn't feel any chemistry between them, and so I couldn't get invested in the romance, unfortunately.
Next, I read Piglets by Clementine Beauvais, which is a French YA story. It's about three girls who are voted the ugliest in their entire school, and to get back at them, for some reason they decide to create a cycling group where they're gonna sell sausages all the way to Paris. There are some more like weird subplots to do with the main character's father, who's a politician, but he doesn't know that he has her as his daughter. So it was just a very weird collection of things. I don't think the translation was quite good enough because it was supposed to be quite funny and lighthearted, but the humour didn't come across as well.
Next, I reread The Perfectionists by Sarah Shepard, and I did this to prepare for my dissertation to see how she dealt with lots of different voices, as there are 6 main female characters, or maybe 5, I don't know, there are a lot. All of these girls were hypothetically planning the murder of Nolan Hotchkiss, who's the most popular and irritating boy in their school. Then when they're all at a party together, Nolan ends up dead, and so they're nervous that they'll somehow be implicated because he was killed in exactly the way they described. It has a lot of the classic Sarah Shepard things like therapy sessions and student-teacher relationships, which I was kind of glossing over because I was mostly interested in it from a narrative point of view, but I definitely appreciated this book a lot more on the second time round. It's also super interesting seeing as PLL, the TV show, has ended and The Perfectionists is seemingly set up to be a spin-off of that show or the next thing that I, Marlene King, is working on, so being re-familiar with the story made me realise it's probably not something I'm going to watch on TV.
Next, I read Alex Approximately by Jen Bennett. This is the story of Bailey, who moves to the West Coast to live with her dad after one of her mum's court cases puts her in a lot of danger. Bailey also goes by the name Mink online, where she talks to a boy called Alex about old movies. Alex wants Mink to come over to the West Coast so that they can go and see some movies together in real life. Then when Bailey starts her new job in a new town, she meets Porter, who she has instant chemistry with, although it's a bit of a love-hate relationship. So she starts feeling like she's cheating on Alex, but it turns out Porter is Alex. That is everything you're told on the blurb. So I didn't know how I was going to feel going into this knowing practically everything that happens, but I still had a really fun time. I love Jen Bennett's writing, that kind of redeems everything for me, but I didn't like this as much as the first book of hers I read, Night Owls. I felt like Alex Approximately had way more adult romance tropes. I also found some of the gay representation very uncomfortable to read about. Bailey kept referring to something called a gaydar. It's so inappropriate now. That just definitely jolted me out of the story and I got very angry about it. And that kind of affected the rest of my reading because I found like I couldn't get into it anymore. So I only gave it 3 stars in the end, but I really loved the first 150 pages. Next, I read The Disreputable History of Frankie Land, and this was such a great read for me because I'd had loads of people recommending it when I asked for feminist reads on Twitter. I ended up giving this one 5 stars because I had such a fun time. It's all about Frankie, who goes to this boarding school that has an elite society that's exclusively for boys, and so she takes it upon herself to try and infiltrate this and prank them all. The book is kind of split into 2 parts though, the first part focusing on her relationship with a senior boy called Matthew, who she's kind of infatuated
infatuated with, but also realises that the age gap and the wealth gap between them means that he has this sense of self-importance that he's really patronising to her most of the time. And so the first half is an exploration of that romance and how boys and girls are treated differently and how they're supposed to act in relationships in comparison to how Frankie wants to act. And then the second half is when she pulls all these pranks and it starts to get really mischievous and funny and really makes use of the boarding school setting. I liked that this was almost 2 books in one, but weaved together really well by such an interesting narrative style where you were very aware of the narrator as a person outside the story that was telling you about Frankie in a really curated way. I'd totally recommend this as a feminist read if you haven't picked it up. I think this book is about 10 years old, but it's still golden, so please check it out.
Next, we both read A Change Is Gonna Come, which is a BAME anthology published by Stripes. As with probably all anthologies, there are a few standouts and a couple that you just think are meh. We did a review of some of our favourites highlighting why we felt they were so important, but overall it was great to get some exposure for these new voices, and I can't wait to see all of their work because 3 out of the 4 especially really resonated with Maddie and I, so I can't wait to follow their careers.
Next, I read The Midnight Peacock by Catherine Woodvine, which is the 4th and final book in the Sinclair's mystery series. This was such a great finale and managed to capture everything that was good about this series in one book. There are a few recurring characters throughout the series that I really liked, so was happy to see them being more prominent in this book too. The friendship and the mystery was really strong, but what I liked the most is that I could appreciate the huge story arc that's crossed this whole series. There also seemed to be the suggestion that there'd be a spin-off series focusing on the 2 girls that run the detective agency, so I'm really excited for that if that's going to be a thing. I'd definitely recommend picking up the first book, The Clockwork Sparrow, if you're interested in historical fiction, in mysteries and middle grade.
Next, I read The Roanoke Girls by Amy Engel, and this is her first adult book. It's a thriller about a woman called Lane, whose cousin Allegra goes missing, which pulls her back to her family town, Roanoke. Roanoke is also a place that makes her incredibly uncomfortable as she starts to reveal more things about her family's history that are very unsavory. I wasn't expecting how dark it was, but it was also very slow and not that enticing. I wanted to know how it wrapped up. By about 70%, you know anyway. So I kept waiting for it to stop or have this climactic build-up or maybe a second reveal, but it was just anticlimactic and in the end not quite worth my time.
Because I was on a middle grade mystery kick, I decided to pick up the next book in the Murder Most Unladylike series, which is First Class Murder. This was a homage to Murder on the Orient Express, and it's set the year after that book was published, so you get loads of parallels to that mystery, and that was super exciting because I'd read that book, so I understood all the references. I love anything that takes place on trains as well, and really isolated locations with a limited cast of characters, so this was my perfect mystery. You can really tell as well that Daisy and Hazel are growing up as this series goes on, and with each book they're just proving themselves more and more as detectives, so I can't wait to continue on with this series, and it's definitely something I'm going to be treating myself to every couple of months.
Next, I read Zenith by Sasha Alsberg and Lindsay Cummings. I was underwhelmed by this story. I felt like it was similar to Red Queen, where you're completely aware that it's just a mashup of tropes from multiple different genres or successful books, and I'm sure lots of people will enjoy it, but I just found it a little bit unimpressive to say the least. I thought that so much was going on. I would have really liked it if it just streamlined a little bit. I found myself slightly confused as well that Andy, the main character, kind of takes a back seat for some of the action, as it's definitely an equally split perspective story. It's all in third person, and the voices of Sasha and Lindsay blend seamlessly together. Subjectively, for me, it was only a 2.5-star book.
Next, I read Lola Offline by Nicola Doherty, which is all about a girl called Delilah who has to create a new personality, Lola, and flee to Paris as she creates an online faux pas by making some racist comments and not stressing their irony. I ended up not really liking this book because it felt like a knockoff of Anna and the French Kiss, with the Paris boarding school and the same dynamic between the friends, and the love interest, which is like the most popular boy at school that she doesn't think she deserves but goes after anyway. One redeeming character from this story was Fletcher, and she was meant to be the popular pretty girl, and there was this horrible girl in the school who was posing her as this huge mean girl that Lola shouldn't want to be friends with, but she ended up being the sweetest person ever. It was odd that I found the online presence in this story on one hand believable and far-fetched at the same time.
The next few books that I talk about I DNF'd. So the first is Everything Must Go, and I DNF'd this at about 30%. It's the story of a girl who follows her teacher crush to a Quaker school, but then it turns out he's not actually going to that school. It's also a contemporary epistolary novel, so it's got blog posts and emails and letters and announcements. However, that's not my favourite thing I just like regular prose, okay?
Next I read Victoria by Daisy Goodwin, and this is kind of like a companion to the TV show, encapsulating the first 4 episodes of the 8-episode series, going from just before her coronation to the moment she proposes to Albert. It's also sparked more of an interest in historical fiction, especially those that deal with queens and monarchs, so maybe I'll have to look into Philippa Gregory, as she's a big name for those kind of books.
Next, Maddie and I both DNF'd The Truth and Lies of Ella Black by Emily Barr. It's the story of Ella, who has a split personality disorder, and she's named her other personality Bella. And Bella's a monster, she's incredibly aggressive, and not a character you want to be reading about particularly. For some reason, her parents decide to yank her out of school and take her over to Brazil, and the reason is to cover up some sort of mystery, but Ella wants to find out what that mystery is anyway. We got to the part exactly where she finds out what that mystery was and then starts disrespecting her parents left and right, and I was like, I don't want to read a character like this. Even Ella's voice was a bit whiny, and the narrative style was similar to Flora Banks in the way that it was repetitive, but unlike Flora, it didn't have a place here.
Next I read Run by Cody Keplinger, and this was one of the books on my summer TBR, and I'm so pleased I read it because I just knew I'd love this book. It's about 2 girls who are polar opposites, Bo and Agnes, and it's all about their friendship first and foremost. You get both of their voices in this story. Bo tells you all about when they run away, and Agnes tells you about the beginnings of their friendship and what happens to get them up to the point where they decide running away is a good idea. Bo is the town disaster and everybody hates their family and spreads loads of rumours about them, and then Agnes is legally blind and has overly protective parents who don't treat her the same way as her older sister, who's allowed all of these freedoms that she isn't. So they feel restricted, but their friendship is the one thing that allows them freedom and where they feel like they can be themselves, or the best version of themselves that they want to be. The way these girls interacted with each other and truly cared about each other was my favourite part of this story. I also really liked the romance that happened in Agnes's half of the story. Agnes's legally blindness is actually from own voices representation, as Cody Keplinger has the same thing, and Bo identifies as bisexual, and that is explored in the text. She uses that label and talks to Agnes about it. If you're interested in stories about supportive female friendships that also have a sense of adventure and great diversity, then I couldn't recommend this one more.
And then I finished up the month by DNFing All the Feels by Danica Stone. I gave up at 149 pages. I couldn't even make it to a round number, it wasn't worth it. This is the story of Liv, the biggest fangirl of the Starvale movies. She watches the 5th movie in the series and finds out that the main character is killed off and she will not take that, so she starts this online hashtag Spartan Survives, which gets her a lot of attention from the creators of the show. At some point I'm pretty sure they go to a convention, but I never got that far because I was so angry at the LGBT plus representation, where Liv literally forgets that her best friend Xander is bisexual just so that she can have the exposition in a text message. I'll actually read you the exchange. Xander: good, because I've kissed my fair share of girls and boys before, it shouldn't be a big deal. Liv: boys? Xander: yes, boys. Liv: really? Xander: a few. Why? Liv: I just didn't realise ... Xander: Liv, you know I'm bi. I told you that when we met. Yes, of course, I forgot. That's cool, Xander. It is. The part I DNF'd at was when Xander seemed to imply that Liv couldn't know if she really wasn't bi if she hadn't kissed both a boy and a girl. No, that's not how sexuality works. You don't need to experience something to know that you either do want a part of it or you don't. So I found that incredibly problematic, and I just like chucked the book across the room at that point.
And to end the video on a much happier note, I have my favourite book of the month, which is Letters to the Lost by Bridget Kemmerer. This is all about Juliet, who writes letters to her mum and then puts them on her gravestone. Declan, who was doing community service at the cemetery, finds one of these letters and responds to it. And Juliet thinks this is a complete invasion of her privacy, and so she responds to him, which sparks this whole letter exchanging thing, and then they get IMs so they can talk to each other much more frequently. It creates a relationship that's really unusual, but both characters come to rely on each other a lot throughout the story. What was confusing me about it was that I was constantly trying to think of it as a princess and criminal romance, as that's the stereotypes that these characters fit into, and you can obviously tell that there's a lot of chemistry between them. But when I finished the book, I was like, there's absolutely no romantic tones in this whatsoever, and so that kind of completely flipped my perspective on this book and almost made me like it more, that it was more a story of these 2 characters coming to terms with the tragic things that have happened in both of their lives and then coming together once the book has ended. I plan on doing a whole review of this book because I just want to talk about it in more detail, so when that arrives I'll put it in the cards and the description, but just know for now that this is a fantastic book. I gave it 5 stars and I can't wait to rave about it more as the year progresses.
So those are all of the books that we managed to read in August.
Thank you everyone so much for watching, and we'll see you in our next video.
Bye!